of Chairman Comer's resolution. The radical D.C. City Council is literally putting the integrity of our election system at risk. They've passed a bill to allow illegal immigrants, Chinese, Russian agents, foreign exchange students, and quite literally anyone else who finds themselves on the streets of D.C. in our nation's capital for longer than 30 days, the ability to vote in elections. This should not be a partisan issue, and you don't have to be a Republican to understand why this is wrong. Voting is a sacred right, regardless of what was just said. Voting is a sacred right. This ridiculous measure disenfranchises millions of legal American citizens and opens up our election system to a host of security issues. In fact, the mayor of D.C. didn't even sign this. Congress must pass this resolution today, but we should also move to pass my bill, H.R. 192, to make it clear to D.C. That they cannot ever allow non-citizens to influence our nation's capital. We're putting every single member, both Republican and Democrat, on the record about whether they support non-citizens voting. Of course, I urge my colleagues in the House and the Senate and President Biden to pass our bill, to pass this measure, to sign it into law immediately. And let me just say one thing in response to my colleague on the other side of the aisle, who a few moments ago said, quote, "We brought back our worst possible instincts," I think when referencing the Republican Party. This tells you everything you need to know. It tells you everything you need to know about Americans. Please listen up. This tells you everything you need to know, that the radicals want you to think that this is normal, and it's not. Americans deserve confidence in our election system and confidence in knowing that only legal American citizens are casting their vote in elections here in this country. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How much time do we have?
It has 14 and a half minutes.
Good. Well, I'm going to take a couple just to respond to the gentleman before he goes, perhaps. When I said that they were returning to their worst possible instincts, that was actually a bipartisan comment, because in the old days it was Democrats, racist Dixiecrats on the House District Committee who lorded over the District of Columbia and denied the people of Washington their rights. So they're returning us to those days where Congress will micromanage the affairs of Washington, D.C. and not allow the people their own self-government. He said you don't need to be a Republican or a Democrat to understand the issue. It would actually help to know your Abraham Lincoln, because of course Lincoln was a major defender of non-citizen voting, to the extent you guys want to act like a super DC council and get into the merits of it. In fact, when he was elected, his opponents, his Southern opponents, said he was elected on the strength of the non-citizen vote in New York, as a matter of fact, and in Illinois and other states where they had so-called declarant alien suffrage, which means if you are on the pathway to citizenship, you're allowed to vote, which is a policy that makes a lot of sense, but different jurisdictions have different policies according to home rule and self-government. When Lincoln was here, his major legislative initiative, interestingly enough, was to abolish the slave traffic in the District of Columbia, because he felt that freedom and democracy should obtain in the nation's capital. That's something that our colleagues should also think about in terms of defining an agenda of their party, and I know they're careening from this issue to that issue. But if you're thinking about D.C., think about what Abraham Lincoln did. And with that, I'm delighted to yield 2 minutes to my distinguished colleague from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Gentlewoman from Texas is yielded 2 minutes.
Pleased to thank the ranking member for his leadership, and of course Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton for her continued consistency in refuting and rebutting wrong-headed and misdirected policies that seem to come year after year. Let me read breaking news from one of the historic newspapers in this month that we begin to focus on Black history. From the Washington Informer, the headline says, D.C. Council blasts House GOP interference in city law. D.C. Council members have lashed out at Republicans on Capitol Hill for seeking to meddle in city affairs. For some reason, Ranking Member Raskin, there was some thought that our friends were riding in on a white horse because there was some disagreement on the council. That disagreement, as you have so effectively said, and with the Congresswoman as well, is that they want to handle their own matters. But let the record be clear that the United States Constitution does not forbid non-citizens from casting their vote in local and state elections and other elections, At least 15 cities currently allow non-citizens to cast ballots in local elections. And particularly, non-citizens were occasionally permitted to cast ballots in local, state, and federal elections in 40 states from the time of the nation's inception until 1926. So we have had a history of local decisions being made by local voters. In this instance, local voters voted and made a decision. Whatever modifications they desire to make, they're not asking this place to implode their work. As we begin to think about voting rights, I would ask my colleagues to help join us in supporting the John Lewis Voting Enhancement Act that we've tried to pass here, Democrats, in this Congress for a long, long time. I'd ask them to help us in the redistricting that skewed and denied Democrats in Texas 2 districts that were legitimately based upon the census that was in fact created by Hispanics and African Americans.
Gentlewoman's time's
I'd
expired.
like to yield the gentlelady an additional minute.
Gentlelady is yielded 1 minute.
But in redistricting across the nation, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, were states in which voting rights were directly undermined. Some of the restrictive legislation that was passed in Georgia and Texas are evidence of the oppression of many in the Friends who are across the aisle parties in states to deny people of color their right to vote. And so it looks as if we have an opportunity here for champions of voting rights that seem to be evidenced across the aisle. Join me in the John Robert Lewis Voter Enhancement Act. But at this time, in this month, we ask that you allow the citizens of Washington, D.C., one, at some point to have statehood, but more importantly in this instance, to stay out of home rule decisions or to stay out of decisions granted to them. Those decisions are granted to them. For that reason, I am enthusiastically in opposition to H.J. Res 24 because this legislation goes beyond the boundaries of the responsibilities, duties, and rights of this body. Leave the government of Washington, D.C. to the people of Washington, D.C. I yield back.
The gentleman